Ukrainian army shelling injures 7 children in Slavyansk as Kiev vows to continue its military operations against pro-Russian activists. Russia's president calls for a halt to the bloodshed in Ukraine, urging Kiev and the eastern separatists to engage in dialogue. Bahrain's human rights activist Nabil Rajab calls for dialogue with the monarchy as security forces continue their crackdown against anti-government protesters. And Sisi's election win receives a mixed reaction across Egypt as both supporters and opponents of the ex-army chief take to the streets. Hello and welcome. You're watching Anatijah World News with me, Sergeant Preradovic. We begin with our top story tonight, and authorities in Kiev have vowed to continue their so-called anti-terrorist operations against pro-Russian activists. Meanwhile, Ukraine's acting defense minister announced that the military mission has been successful in clearing separatists in parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions.
Ukraine's acting defense minister Mikhail Koval has vowed to continue with the government's so-called anti-terrorist operations against pro-Russian activists until stability is restored in the eastern regions. Koval claimed that areas in the south and west of the Donetsk and the north of the Luhansk have been freed during the offensive in the Ukrainian east.
Our armed forces have completed their assigned missions and completely cleared the southern and western parts of the Donetsk region and the northern part of the Luhansk region from the separatists. We will continue working until this region starts working and leading a normal life.
However, with the stepping up of military operations, the situation on the ground is becoming more intense. Early Friday, the city of Slavyansk in the Donetsk region witnessed renewed shelling by the Ukrainian army. According to eyewitnesses, the militia targeted a local children's hospital and a clinic, wounding at least 7 children. For his part, the country's president-elect Petro Poroshenko vowed to punish pro-Russian separatists responsible for downing an army helicopter. In one of the deadliest attacks, an Mi-8 helicopter was gunned down with a sophisticated surface-to-air missile on Thursday, killing at least 14 Ukrainian soldiers. Despite calls from Moscow to halt its military offensive in the region, Kiev has ignored such pleas. Instead, it is intent to resolve the crisis in the eastern regions through the use of force.
Well, Charles Schulbridge is a London-based security analyst, and he says that the Ukrainian president's calls for pro-Russian activists to be brought to justice may prove counterproductive.
Although they're killing relatively large numbers of so-called rebels, so-called separatists in the east, more seem to be appearing. The more deaths and military action that is taking place at the behest, if you like, of this, what the Kiev government's calling this anti-terrorist operation, the more fighters seem to be joining the struggle against the Ukraine authorities. And of course, that's been made worse, if you like, by the deaths of civilians. The more the civilians are killed, the more the local population is likely to be angered and itself seek to support the rebels. It's also becoming clearer, I think, that the rebels are becoming more organised. Even if there are questions about some of their tactics, for example, rebel groups traditionally, if they're going to be successful, are going to adopt guerrilla-type tactics, such as we've seen successfully deployed against Ukraine military units over the past week or so. When they occupy buildings such as they did at the airport, they make themselves a relatively easy target, as we saw when approximately 50 were killed in the last few days. And so it's a mixed picture, in short. On a political level, the new leader, Poroshenko, or president-elect, has made, on one hand, somewhat conciliatory noises towards the population generally in the eastern provinces, particularly, of course, the restive areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, and, of course, has made some public statements, even on his election night, to the effect that he's wanting to cooperate with Putin, as indeed President Putin, as indeed he will have to, of course. It's a very important neighbour if he's going to effectively be the president of Ukraine. But then at the same time, he has made very warlike noises, really from the moment that he became the president-elect. And of course, those are, if you like, exacerbated or reinforced, if you want to put it that way, by his comments today, that he intends to punish and crush the armed rebellion. The problem is that when he does that, as we've mentioned, he will also alienate people who are being killed, for example, when civilians are being caught up in this.
Well, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has called on Kiev to end the bloodshed in eastern Ukraine, urging the two sides to engage in dialogue. In a telephone conversation with his French counterpart, President Putin called for the immediate start of dialogue between authorities in Kiev and representatives from the southeastern Ukraine. The Kremlin said the telephone call between the two leaders was initiated by the French side. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine have made progress in talks in Berlin aimed at solving a growing dispute over natural gas supplies. Delegations from the two countries will meet for further talks in Brussels next Monday if Moscow confirms a partial payment made by Kiev. Russia's Gazprom has warned it will cut off gas supplies to Ukraine if it fails to pay its debt, which exceeds $2 billion, with the deadline expiring on June 2nd.
Today, we have paid an undisputed amount of money for gas supplies at a price of $268 per 1,000 cubic meters. These are the debts for March, February in 2014. That is the amount that we have transferred today to an account of Gazprom. Altogether, that makes $786 million US.
Ситуация очень простая. Есть два контракта действующих.
The situation is very simple. There are two contracts that were not annulled, and these contracts, Gazprom fulfills its obligations for gas delivery. The price is calculated on the basis of a formula, and the Ukrainian party wished not to pay and to agree on a new price. Then, in an ordinary contract situation, we would continue to supply and there would be no questions whatsoever. So now, we are prepared to make a goodwill gesture to allow for discounts or to settle the debts. Since the end of February, not a single cent has been paid for a gas supplied. This is the situation.
Well, as that violence continues to grip eastern Ukraine, Jewish leaders have announced that an evacuation plan will be put into place should the situation further deteriorate, particularly in Odessa. This, as an Israeli agency reported, that the immigration of Ukrainian Jews to the Israeli entity has increased by 142% since last year, amid mounting concerns over anti-Semitic displays in the embattled Eastern European country.
As violence grips the Ukrainian port city of Odessa, Jews are preparing to evacuate should the violence in the city become significantly worse. In fact, an Israeli agency, which provides services to Jews wishing to move to Israel, reported last week that 777 new immigrants had arrived to the Israeli entity from Ukraine since the beginning of the year, a 142% increase compared with the same time last year. The report added that the Jewish community, together with the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, have prepared a fleet of 70 buses, fueled and ready to go if the security situation deteriorates. Those fleeing Odessa in particular increased threefold, the Jewish agency noted on its blog, while 200 additional immigrants in Ukraine have already booked their flights to the Israeli entity this month. According to the Jerusalem Post, Odessa has a Jewish community of about 30,000. The International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem said it has been raising funds from Christians worldwide over recent weeks in order to fly 100 Ukrainian Jews to Israel, including 19 who had arrived last Sunday. While Jewish community leaders are unanimous in asserting that the violence is unconnected to the Jewish community and that they do not feel specifically targeted, they agreed that should the situation worsen, it would be easy for the spillover to affect their very existence.
The Deputy Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, Brigadier General Masoud Yazidi, has warned the U.S. against committing any act of aggression against the Islamic Republic. Yazidi further threatened to annihilate the Israeli entity and wage war against Washington in the event of a U.S. attack against Tehran. The top command's comments comes in response to the U.S. President Barack Obama's recent speech, in which he reiterated that Washington reserves all options against Iran. Moving on to some other news now, and as the revolution continues for a fourth year, Bahrainis held fresh anti-government demonstrations to denounce the relentless crackdown and killing by Saudi-backed security regime forces. This is pro-democracy activist Nabil Rajab called for dialogue only days after being released from jail.
Despite another damning Human Rights Watch report detailing a long list of government abuses against Bahraini citizens, the heavy-handed crackdown is continuing. Security forces used tear gas and bird shots to disperse a protest in the capital Manama. The demonstrators called on Bahraini authorities to hand over the body of a slain protester, Abdulaziz Al-Abbar. 27-year-old Al-Abbar died on April 18 after spending 55 days in a coma due to injuries he sustained during a demonstration in the town of Sar, near the capital, back in February. The Bahraini Center for Human Rights said security forces had fired tear gas canisters and bird shots at Abbar. The regime had been holding his body since then, stirring more anger among Bahrainis as they rally across the island kingdom. Although the monarchy's response to calls for reforms in the tiny Persian Gulf kingdom has been brutal, recently released human rights activist Nabil Rajab says the door is still open for dialogue with the government to end the political deadlock. I am a human rights activist, and that determines my relationship with the government, so I would not refuse to meet anybody if that would help the situation. The government is not serious, it's just playing for time. The royal family does not want to see a balance of power. They want everything in their hands, and as long as that is their attitude, we are not likely to reach a solution. Since 2011, people in Bahrain have been demanding judicial reform, electoral reform, release of opposition political prisoners, and an elected government with full legislative powers. Yet the Al Khalifa royal family have responded with the only way they know how, and that is brutality.
Well, Jawad Fairouz is a resigned Bahraini MP. He joins me now live from London. Mr. Fairouz, how do you expect the Bahraini monarchy to react to Nabil Rajab's calls for dialogue?
This is a call by the opposition inside the Bahrain to have a serious dialogue, but it is so clear that the government is not ready and they are not willing to have this dialogue. Yes, they just use it as a propaganda internationally to show the international community that they are willing to do so, but in the ground they are using the force and security measures as you shown in your report, and it is daily event in Bahrain. So the dialogue from the government side is to detain the activists and to use the judicial system to more captive people, and internationally they say so, they want a dialogue, but in the ground it is totally opposite. In the opposition side, they have a clear map and they are so serious. If they found a serious dialogue to achieve the demands of Bahraini people to shift the current condition to a democratic state, yes, they are serious and they want to have a serious dialogue, but there are no clear evidence that the current regime is willing to do so.
So why then does the opposition keep calling for dialogue if there is no serious partner on the other side? Why does it keep relying on the hope that eventually these demonstrations will lead to some sort of negotiated settlement?
Definitely, the opposition are following in two parallel line strategy. One, they continue their presence in the street and they are trying to use whatever ground uprising in a way that demonstrations, gathering, and as much as they can, they try to be in contact with the international community to show that how the Bahraini people have been oppressed, and frequently they are issuing a detailed report about all this violation. But in the second hand, because the oppositions are realistic and they know that the only solution to the current condition in Bahrain going to be by the serious dialogue. Yes, they are denouncing any type of the violence, but meantime, they don't want to highlight or increase the ceiling of the demand, and if it's not realistic. The realistic issue is that a serious dialogue should be there. Otherwise, we will suffer and the country will suffer, and definitely all of us will lose.
You say that the monarchy in Manama is not ready for dialogue, but doesn't Nabil Rajab's release from jail signal that the regime is looking for some sort of a negotiated settlement?
It's not correct, because Nabil being in prison for 2 years, actually it was 3 years, and by the appeal they reduced it for 2 years, and he finished his term. He's not been freed due to they want to give a good indication that they are willing to have a contacts or change their attitude toward the current condition. Yes, if they free all the prisoners, if they stop attacking the people, and if they stop using the security measures, and if they stop shooting people with a bear shot and tear gas, maybe it's going to be a good indication. But releasing Nabil, I don't think so, because Nabil already spent his 2 years what he been sentenced to.
And the picture you paint, Mr. Fairouz, is pretty grim there. Is there a danger that this protest could turn more violent?
Actually, sometimes it happened, and this is what we are warning too. If the people becoming hopeless and they don't find just to defend themselves, and definitely they will not believe much on the peaceful demonstration, and they will not find any type of the hope that they will get their rights with the current peaceful demonstrations. And definitely the majority of the opposition inside Bahrain is standing with any type of the peaceful activities. Already they signed a certain type of the agreement that they are willing to continue with the peaceful manners, but it is a common reaction by the people if they found out that their peaceful will not reach them or will not achieve their goals. We are afraid so that maybe they will be engaged in more violence as a reaction. But a violence tool is daily being used by the current regime, and we can see this only the regime are using the tear gases, bear shot, live bullet, and meantime killing with the cool blood, like a few days happened to one of the youth, Sayyid Muhsin, 14 years boy, in the street. They shot him in heart by bear shot.
Yeah, and there's certainly been several cases like that over the past 3 years. And over those past 3 years, Mr. Fairouz, what does the opposition feel that it actually achieved? Because this is a cause largely ignored by the international community.
Unfortunately, we hear a lot of promises by the international community, but in action they didn't done much. I think the time comes for them, at least from human rights wise, they can put their pressure on the regime, first of all, to open an office for human rights commissioner related to the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner. And in the meantime, they should put pressure to let a special reporter to visit Bahrain. Then definitely Bahrain should be under the country of concern title of all their annual reports. And meantime, there should be a finding mission from United Nations to Bahrain. And finally, I can say that with the coming Human Rights Council session in Geneva by next month, definitely there should be a resolution against Bahrain. Otherwise, the regime will continue cracking down, continue using the security measures, continue to use all the type of the violence against the people, and they will not care as many as human rights statements to be issued. Yes, we are welcoming this type of the reports, like lately Human Rights Watch, they issued a good report yesterday, and they are independent sources and shown that Bahrain is a system of injustice. But I think this report should be reflected to the action, and now time comes, action to be taken against this government.
Action to be taken against this government. That's resigned Bahraini MP, Mr. Jawad Fairouz, joining us there from London. Thank you very much for your time, sir. Well, the victory of former Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt's presidential elections has received mixed reactions from the public. Clashes have erupted between security forces and supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi, who were protesting over those election results. Now, Egyptian security forces fired tear gas and birdshot to break up the rallies in several cities across the country, including Ismailia, Suez, and the coastal city of Alexandria. The clashes resulted in several injuries, while scores were detained by the police. Meanwhile, in other parts of Egypt, Sisi's supporters took to the streets to celebrate his triumph. In his first comments as president-elect, Sisi vowed to move the country forward and not allow the return to autocracy during his term.
His victory was never in doubt. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's supporters always believed that his charismatic personality would reshape Egypt's political and social landscape. The retired army general is already looking forward to his new role as Egyptian president. The man who swept to power through a series of decisive actions has vowed to put aside any differences and restore security and stability to the country. In mid-June, Sisi will officially take charge of a tenure he claims will not exclude any group. The ex-army chief clinched more than 96% of the votes, to which the streets of Cairo burst into jubilant scenes. Many Egyptians believe it was the climax of a year-long transformation that has placed a popular ruler back at the helm.
I am happy that Sisi won with a big victory, and he has been our president since the 3rd of July last year.
Meanwhile, Sisi's only challenger, Hamdin Sabahi, accepted the will of the people. His disappointment, however, was articulated in the strongest terms. Sabahi conceded the humiliating defeat, but criticized irregularities that marred the course of the electoral process.
Now comes the time where I tell our great Egyptian people that I respect their decision and announce my loss. What we saw in these elections was detrimental to the freedom of choice. Many honest and unbiased factors were not present from executive authorities and the media.
The new president will now certainly have to deal with those who refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the elections. Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers boycotted the vote. Preliminary results even indicated that the vote ballots cast by voters exceeded those managed by the defeated candidate over the past 2 days. Nonetheless, with the win all but officially confirmed, it remains to be seen if Sisi will be able to improve the country's ailing economy and restore stability to the Arab world's most populous nation.
You're with Al Ittijah World News. Do stay with us. Still to come on the program. Will we ever know the whole truth behind the motives for the US-led invasion of Iraq? We'll tell you why the British government said no. Welcome back. These are the top stories that we're following for you here on Al Ittijah. Ukrainian army shelling injures 7 children as Kiev vows to continue its military operations against pro-Russian activists. Russia's president calls for a halt to the bloodshed in Ukraine, urging Kiev and the eastern separatists to engage in dialogue. Bahrain's human rights activist Nabil Rajab calls for dialogue with the monarchy as security forces continue their crackdown against anti-government protesters. Sisi's election win receives a mixed reaction across Egypt as both supporters and opponents of the ex-army chief take to the streets. While the Israeli entity is scrambling to contain the latest wave of protests in its jails after 350 Palestinian detainees joined a hunger strike movement against indefinite administrative detention.
A total of 350 Palestinian detainees have joined the hunger strike in solidarity with those under Israeli administrative detention. This comes after 68 Palestinians have been hospitalized after refusing food for almost 5 weeks. Palestinian human rights organizations reported that the Israeli prisons administration was being very harsh with these detainees and was transferring them to isolation cells and preventing their lawyers from visitation rights. The Palestinian Minister of Prisoner Affairs, Isa Karadak, said in the last 2 days there has been the daily transfer of prisoners from one prison to another, one cell to another, exhausting them and making their situation worse. It's clear that prison authorities are trying to break the strike in any way possible, even if prisoners die. Currently, there are at least 160 people being held under administrative detention, according to a court order issued by Israeli occupation forces. The Zionist regime can detain Palestinians for as long as they want without trial or even providing a reason for their imprisonment. In all, there are more than 5,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails. Many have witnessed firsthand that hunger strike is the most effective practice that detainees can use to retain their freedom, like Samir al-Isawi, who was released after 8 months without food.
Well, the Israeli President Shimon Peres and his Palestinian counterpart Mahmoud Abbas will join Pope Francis for an afternoon prayer at the Vatican on June 8th. Pope Francis had invited the pair to his home during his recent 3-day trip to the Middle East. The Vatican said that the upcoming meetings, which has been scheduled to take place before the 90-year-old Peres steps down from his post at the end of July, was not going to be driven by a political agenda. A video showing al-Qaeda-affiliated militants executing a teenage boy in the eastern Syrian city of Deir az-Zor has recently surfaced on the internet. The amateur footage shows members of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant shooting a teenager in public who was allegedly found guilty of robbery. This video is one of many released since the beginning of the conflict in Syria, as foreign-backed extremist groups have carried out such assaults under the pretext of self-declared Sharia law. Meanwhile, Turkey has ruled out the possibility of giving refugee status to millions of Syrian nationals who have been forced to flee to neighboring countries due to the ongoing violence. Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu said on Thursday that Ankara has limited the right only to asylum seekers coming from Europe, which means that the rest have only been granted a temporary stay in Turkey until they are resettled in another state. The UN Security Council has expressed its disappointment and concern over the fact that presidential elections in Lebanon have not been held. The UN body has demanded that the polls be held without delay. Now, over the past 2 months, Lebanon's parliament convened 5 times to try to elect a successor to President Michel Sleiman, but failed due to a lack of quorum. Lebanon's political paralysis is mainly due to a deep rift between 2 rival camps: Lebanon's Hezbollah-led faction, which backs the Syrian government, while the pro-Western March 14 bloc largely backs the foreign-backed insurgency in next-door Syria. Well, the anticipated truth behind a series of events that led to the US and the UK to invade Iraq in 2013 will not be fully revealed. The British government has decided to prevent the release of the full account of secret talks between former British Prime Minister Tony Blair and former US President George W. Bush in the run-up to the Iraq War.
It seems like the world may never be told why Britain and the US decided to invade Iraq. Some of the answers to that question may lie in the correspondence between British Prime Minister Tony Blair and former US President George W. Bush in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003.
To start by welcoming our witness.
5 years ago, an inquiry chaired by Sir John Chilcot was established to investigate Britain's involvement in the US-led invasion of Iraq. During the hearings, Blair was asked to give his opinion on the 25 notes and 130 records of conversation between him and Bush.
Said we would stand shoulder to shoulder with them. We did in Afghanistan, and I was determined to do that again.
The last public hearing was 3 years ago. On Thursday, Sir John Chilcot and Cabinet Secretary Sir Jeremy Haywood reached a deal in which only part of the secret letters would be revealed to the public. The inquiry's chairman says he's agreed to publish only quotes or gists, not, in other words, full documents. These, he went on, should not reflect President Bush's views, and direct quotation from the documents should be the minimum necessary. The mother of one of the British soldiers who died in the Iraq War is disappointed by the outcome.
Well, the families are a bit disappointed because they think the letters are the most important thing what's in them to let us understand why we really did go into Iraq. We were still told it was the weapons of mass destruction and there was correspondence between Blair and Bush. So with us not seeing what's in that correspondence in these letters, it's put doubts in their minds.
But it's not just the relatives of British soldiers who are grieving. The invasion of Iraq resulted in thousands of Iraqi deaths, with hundreds imprisoned and tortured by the occupying troops. It's been more than 10 years since the Iraq invasion, and there have been speculations that the much-anticipated report was going to be published this year. However, with most of the information filtered out of the letters, the Chilcot inquiry has been criticized for whitewashing the truth, raising concerns over the reasons behind the UK's involvement in the Iraq War.
Well, U.S. President Barack Obama has announced the country's Veterans Affairs Secretary has resigned over a veterans' health care delay scandal that has embarrassed the administration.
A few minutes ago, Secretary Shinseki and Rob Neighbors, who I've temporarily assigned to work with the VA, presented me with the department's initial review of VA facilities nationwide. And what they found is that the misconduct has not been limited to a few VA facilities, but many across the country. It's totally unacceptable. Our veterans deserve the best. They've earned it. Last week I said that if we found misconduct, it would be punished, and I meant it. Secretary Shinseki has now begun the process of firing many of the people responsible, including senior leaders at the Phoenix VA. And a few minutes ago, Secretary Shinseki offered me his own resignation. With considerable regret, I accepted. But as he told me this morning, the VA needs new leadership to address them. He does not want to be a distraction because his priority is to fix the problem and make sure our vets are getting the care that they need.
Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said that Washington will not be distracted from strengthening its military positions in Asia. Hagel told reporters on his way to Singapore for a regional security forum that the emerging threats in all corners of the world will not inhibit U.S. commitment to Asia. The center-left government in Bulgaria survived a no-confidence vote in parliament, the fourth such motion submitted by the conservative opposition. The opposition accused the Prime Minister's cabinet of lacking a clear strategy for the country's troubled energy sector, meddling with the ruling of an independent energy watchdog, and taking closed-door decisions on major projects such as the Russian-backed South Stream gas pipeline. With just 2 weeks remaining until the World Cup kicks off in Brazil, Graffiti has become a tool for those who believe the global event is too much of a burden for the country's struggling economy to express it themselves. Street artists have covered walls in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo with pictures which blame football's governing body FIFA for exploiting Brazil and the local government and neglecting the needs of the poor. They share the belief that $11 billion which have been spent on the World Cup should have been used to improve transportation, healthcare, and education. Two people were killed when UN peacekeepers opened fire on thousands of anti-government protesters in the Central African Republic. Now, unarmed demonstrators gathered in the center of the capital, Bangui, calling for the removal of the interim government and accusing international forces of failing to prevent violence in the country. The rally comes following a deadly church attack on Wednesday in which at least 17 people were killed and 27 others were kidnapped. Well, Indian authorities have arrested 3 suspects involved in a gang rape of 2 teenage girls who were found hanged from a tree in the northern village earlier this week. With some of the rapists on the run, the recurrence of this heinous crime has pitted human rights activists against what is seen as inaction on the part of security forces.
Time hangs heavy in this northern Indian village, but this week the bodies of 2 sisters hung even heavier from a tree than the locals could have borne. After being gang raped by 5 men, the 2 sisters from the Dalit community, aged 14 and 15, apparently thought living with the stigma was a fate worse than death. 3 men have been arrested so far, including 1 policeman, and authorities are on the hunt for 2 more suspects.
The family members complained that they had initially lodged a complaint with the officers at the police station, but they did not pay any heed or give any response. We have registered a case now. The family has alleged that the girls were raped before they were killed. 5 people have been named, in which there are 2 constables too. Some of the accused people have already been arrested.
A post-mortem report has indicated that the victims had probably hung themselves late on Tuesday before being found the next morning.
My sister had gone out around 8:30 to attend a business of hers and was kidnapped by 4 people who did something terribly wrong to her.
Security forces only took action after villagers blocked the main highway near the town of Katra and the Budan district of Uttar Pradesh state to protest against what they claim to be police indifference and inaction. Every 22 minutes, a rape is committed across a nation of 1.2 billion people. But the number is believed to be much higher, considering the reluctance of many victims to come forward. And for many, the government is to blame. Although there are laws against rape in India, authorities have not handled the situation seriously enough, particularly because many of the perpetrators are members of the country's security forces, an issue that underlines the ineptitude of law enforcement.
Well, after taking control of executive and lawmaking powers, the Thai junta has asserted its authority over the country's judicial system, insisting that military rule is very similar to civil court proceedings.
Days after a military coup was mounted, the Thai army has announced that law and order will be enforced to maintain peace among protesters, while insisting that the military justice procedure in the country is the same as that practiced in civilian courts.
Right now, the authority insists it will enforce the law. The procedures and measures which apply will depend on each area and each situation. The only difference between the civil court and the army court is that in this unusual situation, we have imposed martial law. During martial law, there will be only 1 court. In the normal situation, there will be the first court, appeal court, and the Supreme Court. But now we have only 1 court. Otherwise, there is no difference.
A week after seizing power, Thai's coup leader General Prayut Chan-o-cha met central and regional officials and laid out 3 stages that he envisioned for the country before it could be returned to democratic rule, without giving a time frame. According to an army spokeswoman, the country would remain under, quote, special law during the first phase, and then later set up a national assembly and a, quote, reform council. Only then would the country start the process of preparing for elections. Thailand has seen 19 actual or attempted coups since 1932. After the latest coup in 2006, the army generals remained in power for 1 year. But a growing concern is that they may dig in longer this time around.
Well, the Thai army has denied planning the coup that overthrew Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawat's government last week. However, army documents have revealed that the military had already set up a blueprint for the takeover.
12 successful coups in 8 decades. While Thailand's military has orchestrated these takeovers in the past, as the rest of the country watched untouched by the events, this time the army seems to have changed its script. Over 1 week after Thailand's army overthrew the government, it looks like the military establishment isn't leaving Bangkok anytime soon. In fact, taking over the Southeast Asian nation may have been their plan all along. Although the army has denied the coup was pre-planned, documents have revealed that the army had set up a blueprint of how they would respond should the situation spiral out of control. A document drawn up by the Army's Chief of Staff and now coup leader General Prayut Chan-o-cha back in December indicates that the Army should impose martial law if at any time the situation went beyond the control of the police. On May 15, that scenario was put in motion when men armed with guns and grenades killed 3 and injured more than 20 in an attack against anti-government protesters at Bangkok's Democracy Monument. However, a Reuters report back in December revealed that members of General Prayut's team of advisors were secretly backing anti-government protests. Former Premier Yingluck Shinawat herself had sowed the seeds of the anti-government movement last November when the lower house of parliament passed an amnesty bill that could have allowed her older brother and former Premier Thaksin to return from self-exile. Thailand is now in a grey zone. The military junta has suspended the old constitution, muffled the media and imposed martial law, with the lack of any timeline for return to democracy. The generals are promising unspecified reforms, aimed at ending a decades-long power struggle between the royal establishment and the mainly rural-based Red Shirt movement, loyal to populist Thaksin Shinawat. But with the army rounding up politicians and activists belonging to the Red Shirt, stricter measures being imposed on anti-coup protesters, and with no clear successor to the country's ailing 86-year-old monarch, many are wondering if the generals have plans for running Thailand for some time to come.
Well, Japan's Prime Minister said that he supports Southeast Asia over its claim to freedom of sea and air. But only a few days prior to those comments, the U.S. Air Force deployed 2 of its most advanced military drones to northern Japan. The purpose of the unmanned vehicles is, of course, a closely guarded secret, but their characteristics give them the ability to spy on China and North Korea.
With an operational altitude of up to 18.3 kilometers and the capability to fly for more than 24 hours, 2 U.S. Global Hawk drones have been deployed to Japan, where they will remain on the Misawa Air Base, located some 590 kilometers northeast of Tokyo, until October of this year. Although the U.S. Air Force commander has refused to comment on the planned activities of the drones, the Hawk's capabilities are well known, as from Japan, it can easily monitor areas on the Asian mainland, including the neighboring countries of North Korea and China. Meanwhile, in Singapore, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, perhaps feeling more empowered, offered his utmost support to Southeast Asian countries, several of which are locked in maritime disputes with Beijing.
Japan will spare no effort to support the efforts of ASEAN countries to maintain the safety of the sea and skies and to better preserve freedom of air and sea navigation. We do not welcome dangerous maritime encounters by fighter planes and ships. What should be exchanged are words. Let's sit at a table, first exchange smiles and have a discussion.
However, as Japanese and Chinese vessels and aircrafts continue their game of cat and mouse near the disputed isles in the East China Sea, fears are rising over the possibility of an accidental clash, which has the potential to spark a military conflict. While Abe stressed that Japan's alliance with close security ally the United States was the cornerstone of stability in the region, others in his country have staged demonstrations since April against the deployment of the U.S. drones.
Well, in a country widely regarded as the birthplace of organized crime, it's not easy to stay out of the family business. But the story of Luigi Di Ciccio, an Italian who grew up as the son of a mafia boss, shows that sometimes sharing blood doesn't always mean sharing the same choices in life.
A husband, a father, and the owner of a successful restaurant in the seaside town of Civitavecchia, Luigi Di Ciccio lives the life of any ordinary Italian. So ordinary, in fact, that one would never guess he is the son of the mafia boss, Giuseppe Di Ciccio, from the Camorra, or Napolitano clan. Growing up in the shadows of a clan boss, Luigi's childhood in the mid-80s was grasped in a world consumed by organized crime. His father was not there the day he was born. Instead, he was where most mafia members end up these days, behind bars. The only father-son talks Luigi remembers came every few weeks at visiting time in a high-security prison. Meanwhile, back home, Luigi was growing up in a house run by his father's mafia brothers, and there were often police raids. However, Luigi managed to stay away from staining his hands with his family's business, and even though his father was paying for serious crimes, from drug dealing to murder, Luigi loved him unconditionally. He says his father always wanted a different life for him, continually urging him to build a future away from the world of the mafiosi. He dropped out of school and then began door-to-door selling. Later, he did his military service and then found work in a kitchen in a town further north in Italy, away from his roots. He admits it wasn't easy to avoid falling into the trap that life had extended before him, and hopes his story may be an example to other young people back where he came from in southern Italy who might be tempted to take the wrong path.
Okay, let's take another look at those headlines now. Ukrainian army shelling injures 7 children as Kiev vows to continue its military operations against pro-Russian activists. Russia's president calls for a halt to the bloodshed in Ukraine, urging Kiev and the eastern separatists to engage in dialogue. Bahrain's human rights activist Nabil Rajab calls for dialogue with the monarchy as security forces continue their crackdown against anti-government protesters. Sisi's election win receives a mixed reaction across Egypt as both supporters and opponents of the ex-army chief take to the streets. Well, that's all the time we have for in this edition of AEE TV World News. From me and the news team, thanks for watching.